A few years ago, I got to be part of a team smuggling Bibles into Afghanistan to give them to the Taliban. We went into their military headquarters and we met the top brass of that movement. We met the education minister, we met the foreign minister, we met the religion minister. And when we gave them Bibles in their own language, they were all heavily armed, they all had their Kalashnikovs right there, just sort of slung over their shoulders. We kind of expected to be shot. So it was a surprise when the religion minister of the Taliban took hold of the Bible and he said, "I know exactly what this book is. I have been praying for years that I could read this book. Thank you for bringing it to me." In some parts of the world, people are hungry for the Bible, but I bet at your school there will be lots of people saying the Bible is just fairy tales, it's been made up by people, or it's been changed. There's this long process and people just added their own little thoughts. We can't actually trust that there is an accurate record of anything in there. Or maybe, the Bible is fine for you. It seems to make you happy to go to church, but it's not true in the sense that it should apply to me who doesn't particularly want to go to church. So we're going to look together at some of these issues this morning. So, first question when we think about the Bible, what is it made of? Well, the Bible isn't just one book. It's a collection of 66 books divided into two sections, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. Now, lots of people think the Bible is the tool of oppression for the white man's religion. It's been sort of like the rule book for imperialistic, oppressive regimes. So it may surprise you to know that the Bible is actually written not by a little group of white men, but written over a period of 1,600 years by more than 40 authors who are people from all sorts of different backgrounds. We do have kings and diplomats, but we also have poor people writing, people like fishermen, people like Amos in the Old Testament. He was a dresser of sycamore fig trees. That was the dirtiest job in that culture. The Bible is written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and it's written on 3 continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe. And then that vast spread of the original context within which the Bible was written by all these different people from different cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds, that is multiplied in terms of diversity as the New Testament in particular was picked up by people who became Christians and translated into their language from the very earliest time. And that means that when we come to look at the text of the Bible, the ancient text, there are loads of manuscripts in lots of languages in all sorts of locations of the earth in order to attest to the text of Scripture. So, ancient writing, can we trust it? Is it just a load of fairy tales made up by people? Well, when it comes to ancient writings, there are different questions we can ask in order to assess whether really it's rational to trust it. Number 1, how many copies do we have? Number 2, how close are those copies to the original? Is there a long time difference between when the thing was written down and the thing that actually still survives today? And number 3, how close was that original from the events that it claims to record? So firstly, how many copies do we have? And we can compare this with other ancient works. You've probably heard of Plato. I'm sure lots of you haven't read Plato, but hopefully some of you have heard of him. Well, his works, his incredibly influential works, are based on 7 surviving manuscripts. Caesar's Gallic War, you may have heard of Julius Caesar. If you've heard of him and the history around him, we've got 10 copies. Well, what about Homer's Iliad? If any of you do Greek here, you might have heard of that. Well, there are 643 for Homer. So what about the New Testament? Not 7, not 10, not 643, but upwards of 30,000 witnesses to the text. Well, how close are they in time to the original? Remember, that's a really important question. Surviving manuscripts that you can go and look at in the British Museum or wherever around the world that you could hold in your hand and see today and when it was written. What's the difference? What's the time difference? Well, when we look at Plato, it's a distance of 1,200 years between when it was originally written and the surviving manuscripts today. When we look at Caesar, it's 1,000 years between when it was written and the surviving one today. When we look at Homer, we're talking about 500 years between when it was originally written and a copy that has been copied and copied and copied through generations and survives today. When we're talking about the New Testament, we're talking about between 25 and 50 years. And this is a moving feast. Even just in the press recently, you may have heard about a collection of manuscripts from the New Testament that has been discovered in Turkey containing the earliest fragment of Mark's Gospel from the 1st century. Well, how close from the events are the originals? How close are the people who are writing what happened to what actually happened? Now, this is important because we have such early manuscripts. There isn't a long time difference between when the gospel writers wrote down what they saw and what actually happened. Now, why do people want there to be a large gap between when the Gospels were written and when Jesus actually walked the earth? Well, historically, it's been because of the miracles. You see, some people have tried to say, Jesus was a really good man, and he never really wanted any of this sort of divinity stuff or people worshipping him or, bowing down to him. He was just a really good teacher. And what happens is the church wanted Jesus to be more than that. So they inserted miracles into the accounts. They made up all the divine stuff about Jesus because it fulfilled, their agenda. Now, for a long time, that idea held sway. The Gospels were written a long time after Jesus. The miracles were put in later. But actually, when you look at the evidence, this doesn't stack up. The miracles are there in the early records. And now the earlier and earlier manuscripts are being found. People like Dr. John Robinson, who was part of the whole Death of God movement, and he was an Anglican bishop who said he didn't believe in God. He changed his mind because he discovered the evidence. Having written Honest to God, he then wrote a revolutionary book called Redating the New Testament, talking about dates for the Gospels as early as 40, 45, and 60 AD. Why? Because the manuscripts are there. It supports an early composition. That means that there wasn't time for this conspiracy of people to get hold of Jesus and add these other things onto him, like miracles. It means the miracles are original to the account. Well, what did people write on? During this era, there are really two types of material. The most commonly used was called papyrus. That's a bit like plywood. Today it was lots of layers of reeds glued together, laid out in the sun to dry, and then written on. The thing about papyrus is that it was quite cheap. It was quite commonly used, but it's also quite fragile. So early bits of the New Testament tend to be on papyrus, but they tend to be quite small fragments, maybe this big or even this big, surviving because they've broken off over all the years. The other material is called parchment. That was made from the skin of sheep or goats, and it was used until the Middle Ages when paper came in. Now, the oldest complete copy of the New Testament, as far as we know, is called the Codex Sinaiticus, and it's in the British Museum. You can go and see it. It's in Greek. It contains the whole New Testament. It's dated from between 330 to 360 AD, and the whole New Testament is there. We've obviously got earlier pieces of the New Testament, but as a whole surviving copy, that's a good one to know about. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard the idea that, a group of men, sinister men, got together, a council of the church, and they all argued about what should be in the Bible and what shouldn't be, and they got rid of the bits they didn't like, and they just kept the bits they wanted. Well, that meeting, supposedly discussing the canon of the church, of the New Testament, happens in 397 AD, so after the Codex Sinaiticus was written. In other words, those people didn't decide what was going to be in the Bible at all. They gathered together and affirmed what the church already knew. Can we trust it, though? Is it a load of fairy tales, even if it's been passed down really, really well, really accurately, really carefully? Can we really trust that this is eyewitness stuff? After all, we're being asked to base our lives, to change our lives on the substance of who Jesus was and what he said. Well, I think there are some questions we can ask that help us determine whether the Gospels were really eyewitness, whether they really knew what had happened, and whether they were really accurate. The first question, if you're writing notes, is this: where were the Gospels written? Now, according to history, not all 4 Gospels were written in Judea, Palestine, where the events happened. In fact, Mark's Gospel was written in Rome. Luke's Gospel was written in Antioch, possibly Rome. John's Gospel was written in Ephesus, that's in Turkey today. And Matthew's Gospel was written in Judea. Now, if you were skeptical, if you're thinking, I really don't want to listen to all this Jesus stuff, if you're not, thinking, oh, I'd love it to be true, and sort of just naively following, if you're skeptical, you might think, how could someone writing in Turkey, Italy, Antioch, how could they know what happened in Judea, Palestine? Surely that test of geography isn't good for the Gospels. What that test of geography enables us to do is to ask questions about the writers. How familiar were they with the land they're talking about? Do they know the geography, the agriculture, the botany, the architecture, the traditions, the burial practices, the economics, the language, the law, the personal names, the incidental details that are included in the accounts? Now, if you've never visited a place and you live far away from that place, thousands of miles, it's really hard to get those small details accurate. So the next question I want to ask is, do the writers call people the right thing in the Gospels? If I were to stand here today and ask you, what are the 10 most popular baby names for girls and boys in 2015 in Britain, would you be able to tell me? Without going on your smartphone. Would you be able to tell me? If I were to ask you, what are the 10 most popular male and female baby names in Switzerland? Without talking to those Swiss people, without going on the internet, would you be able to get it right? This is incredibly difficult to get right. The classic scenario of parents who think they've given their child a really, really unusual name, and then there are 6 of them in their year in reception, and they kick themselves and think, should have gone with a more normal name. Well, in the time of Jesus, an academic study has been done by someone who's not a Christian at all. They were just doing this piece of research, not connected to trying to prove the Gospels or anything, doing a study of the 3,000 name occurrences found on inscriptions, found in documents, found on tombs, just found in all sorts of archaeological places to find out what people were called. And the academic study is called the Tali Lam Lexicon of Jewish Names in Late Antiquity, Part 1, and it was published in 2002. Now, I'm sure you're fascinated to hear that. What's amazing about it, though, guys, is that a Christian scholar picked up this study and he thought, you know what, it'd be really interesting to see and compare what people were actually called that we know from a statistical study and what the Gospel writers say people were called. Now, taking Palestinian Jewish male names in the 1st century, this is the order of popularity. 1 Simon, 2 Joseph, 3 Lazarus, 4 Judas, 5 John, 6 Jesus, 7 Ananias, 8 Jonathan, 9 Matthew, 10 Manaen, 11 James. Compare it with the New Testament. Those names sound quite familiar, don't they? If you take the top 9 Jewish male Palestinian names together, outside the New Testament, they're 41% of all name usage. Inside the New Testament, they're 40% of all name usage. It's a pattern that shows up over 4 writers, writing their different books. And the Gospels reflect that pattern individually as well as corporately. Now you might think, okay, well, maybe they just didn't have much name variation back then. But if you go to the next door country, Egypt, and you look at what people were called, a similar academic study in Greco-Roman Egypt of Jewish men, what were they called? Number 1, Eleazar. Number 2, Sabbateus. 3, Joseph. 4, Dositheus. 5, Pappus. 6, Ptolemaeus. 7, Samuel. And so it goes on. Now, names like Sabbateus, Pappus, and Ptolemaeus, fortunately, are not that familiar to us. And they're not in the Gospels. Why not? Because the Gospels are not written about Jewish people living in Egypt. They're written about Jewish people living in Judea, Palestine. This would be incredibly difficult to get this right. Remember, when you're writing thousands of miles away in maybe Turkey, in maybe Greece, maybe Italy, to get that detail right is astonishing. And it's only been known by academics since 2006. Yet it's this staggering proof, this staggering evidence that the gospel writers took history seriously, that they knew what they were doing, that they got the details right. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to see a film and you go out and you start discussing it afterwards with your friends and you can remember the plot. But very quickly you forget the names for the characters. It happens to me all the time as I get older. And then there's the added confusion of the actor's actual name and their character's name. Names fall out of stories very quickly, so to get this kind of detail right is amazing. Well, the gospel writers don't just get the right statistical usage of names. They also get the right features of how names would have been used. So Matthew's Gospel, chapter 10, you may want to open it if you have a Bible with you. Verses 2 to 4, we have this list of the disciples. And I don't know if like me, you kind of skip over lists when you read the Bible, but actually this is really interesting. You see, what happens in this list is that Matthew, writing his Gospel, knows when to differentiate a popular name and say which version of that popular name he's talking about, and when not to do that, when the name wasn't so popular. So Simon, he's number 1 on the popularity list. Simon will be happy to hear that on the front row here. He's called Peter and Andrew, his brother. James, he's number 11. He's the son of Zebedee. John, he's number 5. He's his brother. Philip, poor old Philip. He's only 61 on the most popular name list, so he gets no qualifier whatsoever. Bartholomew, he's only number 50, nothing for him either. Thomas does not even make it into the top 100 of popular names, so nothing about him, he's just Thomas. There only would have been one of him. Matthew, he's number 9, he's the tax collector. James, number 11, is the son of Alphaeus. Thaddeus, he's 39 on that popularity list, no qualifier. Simon, number 1, the Canaanian. Judas, number 4, is Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. These statistics have only been known by academics since 2006. So this is not something that could have been fabricated or fluked. This is evidence, strong evidence, that what we have in the Gospels is historical. And it's not just kind of broad brushstrokes historical. It's accurate, it's correct about detail. And I think that calls for an intake of breath. Part of my job, I go to different universities and talk to people, and there's so many people have just been brought up in Britain and assume there's no reason to trust the Bible. And they hear something simple like this, and it's shocking to them, shocking. There's actually historical evidence for what we believe. Well, we could look at it with another test of geography, but we haven't got time. Or we could look at it with what I call the test of botany. Zacchaeus, he visited Jericho and he climbed that sycamore fig tree. How many here have survived Sunday club with, lots of craft? And we've all probably made Zacchaeus in a tree. That kind of detail. Were there sycamore fig trees in Jericho? And how would Luke know that? He went there, he spoke to someone who was there. This is the sort of thing people who've been to a place know. Now, we could do this study about personal names. We can do it about the economic system. We can do it about the shapes of houses. We can do it about the botany. We can do it about the geography. They wouldn't have had access to maps from Rome, and yet they get the geography, including walking distances between places, absolutely accurate and correct. Now, skeptics might say, well, either the early Christians just kind of bungled everything. They got everything wrong. They didn't care about detail. It's not about history. It's all about faith. But this evidence doesn't stack up with that. So our friend might say, well, then it's all a big conspiracy. The gospel writers, they've really worked on those details. But how could they do that? People of REBOOT 2015, it's shocking for you, I know, to hear. In the ancient world, they didn't have Google. They couldn't fact check in the same way. This is amazing evidence that the Bible can be trusted. The test of botany, geography, personal names, these are not fairy stories casually made up. This is history, carefully, conscientiously recorded for us and then passed on, copied, preserved with extraordinary care through the generations so that today we can still read this text. As we finish, I want to finish with another story. I've been to China a few times in my life, and one of the things that strikes me about China is how much people love the Bible and how God seems to work through the Bible in comparison to perhaps how some of us feel about it. And this story came from a friend of mine. They were smuggling Bibles into China. Here's the story. Chris and his team stood at the pickup point where they were going to meet their contact who would deliver the Bibles, and they arrived with only minutes to spare. But their contact didn't show up. Knowing they were being watched by the authorities, the team started walking to the edge of town as though leaving. Hot and tired, they stopped at a nearby park for a drink of water, for some rest and prayer. It was hard to understand why, after all the difficulties they'd come through, something had gone wrong and they hadn't met the contact. Soon, the team became aware of 3 very ragged and dirty men under a tree behind them. Chris felt the Lord leading him to go over with some water, and when he offered the water, one of the men spoke the password suddenly and very clearly in English. The rest of the team hurried over and pieced together the men's story from the little Chinese they knew. 2 years earlier, God had given them a word in one of their church services that they should plan for this trip, that he would lead them to this park on this date and have Bibles ready for them, and they would be brought by white men from far away. And because they were all farmers and they were quite poor, it had taken them a long time to save enough money for food and shoes to last the trip. The men had walked for 2.5 months, mostly at night, to keep from being arrested. Coming from the far north near Mongolia, they'd climbed a range of snow-capped mountains, travelled through the desert, and crossed several rivers without a compass or any knowledge of the country. All they could explain was that God had shown them where to go. How did they know the password when they didn't speak English? How did they survive the heat and the snow without protective clothing? How did they arrive on exactly the right day? When the men saw the Bibles, they cried and praised God for a long time, and they brought cloth bags to carry the Bibles home in faith. And inside each one, they brought a small watermelon as a gift of appreciation. Even though they'd been without food for several days, they hadn't eaten a single watermelon. The team exchanged clothes with them, and Chris explained what an honour it was to put on those dirty rags. The shoes were completely worn out, but the team chose to go barefoot and give up their own shoes, which fit perfectly. Apparently, God had chosen each team based on shoe size. Many tears were shed as the team prayed and the Chinese brothers went home. Amongst the detail, and I really want to encourage you to know your heritage as Christians, to know that the Bible can be trusted and to have a confidence in the text. But don't let that interest in, the evidences or the details detract us from knowing that this book is incredibly powerful. And God speaks to his people, and he speaks to those he's calling home through that book, through the Bible. So thank you for listening.